Okay, so we're ready to commence. Just a couple of small housekeeping details. So as we go through the presentations this morning and today and tomorrow, we will have questions, opportunities for all commissioners. There are public comment and questions throughout the agenda. I think the first one starts today at 13:30 after the stock assessment. So there will be opportunities for others on the line to ask and make comments. But that'll be the first one for public comment. So if you're ready to go, John, we're ready here.
Yeah, ready to go. Just want to say thanks to everybody from the Secretariat for putting all the information together. Very helpful, and look forward to the discussions today and tomorrow.
Okay, Dave.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. If we could just have the agenda up on the screen, please. Okay, so thanks, Chair. So the first task is for us to just quickly step through the agenda for the meeting to see if there are any other modifications, additions that the commissioners would like. So I'll pass back to you and see if there's any amendments.
No, right, John?
No changes here, Paul.
Okay, thanks, John. So yeah, we would adopt the agenda then, Dave.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So with that said, we can move on to agenda item 3, which is IPHC processes. So we have a number of presentations, just very brief papers that we are providing for the meeting. And so if we have the first under agenda item 3.1, which is paper 03, please, up on the screen. So paper 03 is the update on actions arising from the 100th session of the IPHC annual meeting and any intersessional decisions, and also the recent special session that was held to adopt a FIST design for 2024. I'm not going to step through these in great detail other than to refer you to Appendix A. Within Appendix A, we have the various actions arising from the 100th session of the Commission. There were no recommendations, but 4 requests, and all of those requests have been completed or were completed soon thereafter the IM100 meeting. In addition, as Appendix B, we have a list of intersessional decisions that were undertaken by the Commission via correspondence in 2024. There are 7 shown within this paper. All 5 of 7 have been completed, with the only 2 that are pending relating to the management strategy evaluation and harvest strategy policy work that Dr. Hicks is going to present to you as an update and a proposal later this afternoon, most likely. So those are the only 2 contained within Appendix B that are in progress. In addition, since the paper deadline, there were 3 other intersessional decisions that the Commission made. The first intersessional decision 08, which was the adoption of the FY 2025 budget, and so that has been completed and adopted by the Commission. And then in addition, intersessional decision 09 and 10, which related to the Fishery Independent Setline Survey design for 2025. And these arose following the 14th special session of the Commission, where the Commission requested additional information on potential design options for the survey for 2024. And so that has now been adopted, and we're again going to hear from the team a little bit later this morning or early this afternoon on what that 2025 Fishery Independent Setline Survey design would look like, as well as a decision from the Commission to move funds from the General Reserve at IPHC through to Fund 40, which is for the FIST, to help pay for some of those additional stations that were to be sampled in 2025. And so that's all I have on this paper, Chair.
Thanks very much, Dave. Any questions from commissioners for Dave? I don't see any hands up. David?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. The next is agenda item 3.2, which is the report of the Secretariat. And this is just an update. We don't need to see the paper on screen. It is just an interim update noting that the paper was published 30 days ago, and so it is not a complete summary of the additional actions that the Secretariat has implemented in 2024. I will just quickly highlight, though, that the IPHC Merit Scholarship recipient, Mr. Shea Davis from Cordova, was selected by the panel, and they were unanimous in their recommendation that Shea receive the Merit Scholarship for 2025 and the next couple of years. And this complements our existing Merit Scholarship recipient, Lucy Hankins from Seward, Alaska, who has, I believe, another 2 years to go with the Merit Scholarship. And so that's all I'll highlight from that report. Pause there, Chair, to see if there are any questions.
All right, thanks, Dave. Any questions from commissioners? Don't see any, Dave.
I have one, Paul.
Oh, John's hands up.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Not a question so much as a comment. So on pages 3 and 4 of the Secretariat report, it mentions our decision last year to change the season start time on opening day to start at 0600 rather than at noon. And that, as commissioners will recall, was something that was brought up to us from stakeholders as a kind of a more efficient way of getting the season started on the opening day. Folks may recall that posed a bit of a dilemma on the U.S. side because under our regulations applicable to groundfish, including sablefish, that specifies a start time of 12 noon. So we worked out some language for how to deal with that with any incidental catch of sablefish for folks who are targeting halibut. I flag this only because this is something that we were going to raise for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council in case the council wants to recommend to NOAA Fisheries a change in the regulations applicable to sablefish to have that correspond to an 0600 opening on the first day. It's not unworkable the way it is now, but it's maybe a little bit messy. And so I just thought I'd raise this so that halibut stakeholders can be thinking about it. And if there is still widespread support for the 0600 start, that would certainly inform whether we want to make any changes to the domestic measures for sablefish on the U.S. side. So that's all I had. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, John. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're thinking of carrying on with the 0600 start time, but did you have a solution for that as far as dealing with sablefish? Is that what I was hearing?
It would require a regulatory change on our part if we're going to marry up the regulations, as opposed to providing guidance that would require the discard of sablefish on the morning of that first day, because there's no retention allowed now before the sablefish season starts officially.
Okay. Thanks for bringing that to our attention, John. Are there any other questions from commissioners? I don't see any, Dave.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chair. Moving on to agenda item 3.3. And so this is a brief update on the implementation of the recommendations of the second performance review. And so if I could just have that paper brought up on screen, please. Thank you very much. And so just as an update, we have been implementing and working towards the implementation of the recommendations from the second performance review of the IPHC. And sort of to cut to the chase, on the screen is an update on the status of each of the 26 recommendations that were put forward by the panel to the Commission. And I'm pleased to advise that as of publication of this paper, 23 of the 26 recommendations have been completed and or are annually ongoing. And there's quite a number of recommendations associated with the performance review that were about general governance improvement over time. And so this is something that we just work towards with the Commission and your advisors to implement improvements to the rules of procedure, the financial regulations and the like, to improve our overall functioning and governance of the Commission. What I will focus on very quickly are the three that remain in progress. And so provided at Appendix A are each of those recommendations from the performance review panel. We do have the recommendation 09, which is currently pending, and this is for further discussion surrounding the two contracting parties engaged to develop minimum data reporting standards. We don't have any updates on that at this point, and so it's still remaining there as in progress. The other two recommendations are focusing specifically on the harvest strategy policy, the development and implementation of a harvest strategy policy. And you're going to receive quite detailed updates from Dr. Hicks later today, associated with the discussions arising from the Management Strategy Advisory Board, and also at the work meeting of the Commission with the intention of tabling a harvest strategy policy draft for potential adoption at IM100. So this information is incorporated within paper 12 before you today. And so unless there are any strong need for questions at this point, I would suggest we defer any additional comment on these two recommendations arising from performance review to that discussion to be presented by Dr. Hicks later today. And that's all I have on this item. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thanks, Dave. I think Gary's suggestion makes good sense. We can wait for that and hear that presentation, which I'm sure will lead to some questions. Are there any comments or need to read them? Don't see any hands up, Dave. I think we can move on.
Right. Thank you very much, Chair. Okay, so the next agenda item 3.4, and there are actually two reports of the Management Strategy Advisory Board, or two meetings that were held in 2024, the 19th and 20th session, so a slight amendment there. And Dr. Hicks is just going to briefly review the recommendations that arose from MSAB 20, and then I believe the co-chairs are also available and have indicated that they are able to chime in with any additional clarification that may be necessary. And so may I have the MSAB 20 report up on screen, please? Okay, and so I'm just going to scroll to the recommendations at the end of the report, and then I'm going to pass to Dr. Hicks, who is going to walk through that detail for you. So through the chair, over to you, Dr. Hicks.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, and good morning, commissioners. If you can scroll up right there, yeah, on that page. There, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, there were two MSAB meetings this year, MSAB 19 and MSAB 20, one held in May, one held in October. And there was also an ad hoc working group meeting of the MSAB that occurred over the summer to talk about objectives. And I feel personally that all of these meetings were very successful this year. I just want to step through some of the high-level outcomes of all these meetings, but I do recommend having a look through the recommendations and requests that are provided in the executive summaries of these two reports. From MSAB 20, recommendation 1 is the MSAB recommended the Commission priority objective optimize average coast-wide TCY be changed to maximize average coast-wide TCY. But I think it's also important to recognize the second part of this recommendation in that this objective, along with variability in yield objective, which has been known as objective D in the priority list of objectives, be given equal consideration. And this is really to allow for the evaluation of the trade-off between maximizing yield and minimizing the variability, the interannual variability in yield. So the MSAB felt that this flexibility is a really important concept. And the SRB actually encouraged the MSAB to consider changing the optimize to maximize so that it's a more directly measurable objective and something that has quantitative meaning. The recommendation 2 is a recommendation related to a management procedure, and the MSAB recommended updating the reference management procedure, that current reference management procedure, for 1 3-year cycle on a trial basis using a triennial stock assessment frequency. So having the stock assessment occur in 2025, and then no stock assessment occur in 2026, 2027, but instead using the FIS, the proportional change in the FIS 032 WPUE, as a proxy for the change in the TCUI in those years. And then, of course, that would mean another stock assessment occurring in 2028. And the MSAB felt there's a lot of reasons, which I'll go through later in the MSE presentation today, on why this is a desirable management procedure to implement. But the MSAB felt that it would be worthwhile to just put this in on a trial basis for 1 3-year cycle, just to get an understanding of how it works and to understand the whole process a little better. The other part of this recommendation is changing the reference SPR to a 46%, which is currently 43%. And the reasoning behind that is from the MSE simulations, the interannual variability really starts to increase when the SPR is at values lower than 46%. So fishing harder than an SPR 46% seemed to increase the interannual variability in the TCUI. So to summarize, this one is moving to a triennial stock assessment frequency and changing that SPR to a 46%. And we'll give more reasoning when we present that in the MSE later today. Third recommendation is that the MSAB recommended further evaluations and examining further elements of the management procedures. And then recommendation 4 is that the commission consider endorsing the draft harvest strategy policy. And the draft harvest strategy policy was reviewed by the MSAB at MSAB 20. And there was one request for a minor change in that, which the Secretariat has made, but has not been posted on the interim meeting website at this time. And then finally, the 5th recommendation from MSAB 20 is to hold a MSAB meeting in May, the first half of May 2025, over a 2 to 3 day period. And just to note, there was a lot of desire by MSAB members to have 2 meetings a year. They felt that it was a useful meeting cycle this year. However, they would prefer to have at least one of those in person every year. And so one thought was for MSAB 21 to be held in May, be an in-person meeting. And there was discussion about potentially locations other than Seattle that still might be not too costly. So those are the 5 recommendations. I just want to make one more note from MSAB 20. There's actually 10 members that are set to expire at the end of 2024. And of those 10 members, I have not heard that any of them are not considering serving further. So in other words, it looks like all 10 members would like to be renewed on their membership. And that's, I believe, something we can take up at the annual meeting. And as Dr. Wilson noticed, or noted, the co-chairs are online also, and I can answer any questions you might have.
All right, thanks very much, Alan. Any questions for Alan? John.
Thanks, Paul. Alan, on the recommendation to switch from optimize TCUI to maximize, perhaps I missed it, but I'm a little surprised that there's no mention of sustainability there, like the concept of MSY. Presumably we don't just want to hit the stock hard regardless. We want to be conscious of being sustainable. So I wonder if you could speak to that. Yeah,
thanks, Commissioner Kurland. And my apologies for not giving the whole picture, but the whole picture is, and I'll present some of this in the MSE presentation today, there's still the 4 priority objectives of the commission. And in priority order, the first one is to maintain the halibut stock above 20% of unfished spawning biomass. So that's really the sustainability objective. And then the second objective, which the MSAB did have a lot of discussion about is the objective related to maintaining the stock above 36% of unfished spawning biomass, which is more of a proxy for MEY. And so that priority objective would remain as the second priority. So we would want to analyze MSE results to meet those two objectives before considering maximizing the yield and minimizing the interannual variability in yield. So those concepts of sustainability still remain in the priority listing of the objectives.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. I guess I'm just a little concerned that sort of in the shorthand reference to maximizing TCEY, that context might get lost somehow. And I'm wondering if there's some way to capture it succinctly so that context doesn't get lost.
Sure. I think that will be useful to consider when I present the objective during the MSE section today. And if the commission has any ideas how to make that improvement, I'd be certainly open to hear.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just one quick question in regards to triennial stock assessment frequency, and that is that you would follow, the recommendation is to follow FIS, and I assume that's at a coast-wide level?
Yes, that's correct, Commissioner DeGree.
Okay, thank you.
Not seeing any other questions, Alan, so I think we can move on to.
Paul, I got a question.
Oh, sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
I don't know if my hand came up. Alan, the difference between maximize and optimize relative to the 2024 season on the chart that we usually get at the end of the meeting, what would be the difference between what optimizing the average coast-wide and maximizing in terms of where we ended up?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Allison. A really good question. And there's a real subtlety there between optimizing and maximizing. The SRB brought this up, I believe, at the September meeting, and their concern was optimizing was somewhat vague for a MSE type analysis, where we really try to have quantitative performance metrics or quantitative objectives, and we can quantitatively look at the results and find the best management procedure. And that's why they suggested moving to a maximize, because we would know what is the maximum yield subject to all the other objectives. But related to your question, is optimizing, well, I guess, first of all, MSE is the process of simulating into the future and then looking over at a whole bunch of simulation results and trying to find which one maximizes the yield. And so optimized yield incorporates a lot of other concepts, such as, considerations for certain regulatory areas, other socioeconomic concepts that the commission considers every year. So I think in the annual decision-making process, the commission is actually attempting to optimize the yield instead of maximize the yield. In the MSE process, looking at the long-term outcomes of managing, given a certain management procedure, we might want to look at more maximizing it. And because we just don't have a really good definition of what optimal means in the term of this objective of related to yield. If we have a better definition of what optimal yield is, exactly what optimal yield is in a quantitative sense, which the SRB is pushing towards, then we could analyze that in the MSE. But at this point in time, it's just quantitatively easy to use maximize instead of optimal, which doesn't have a specific definition.
I'm sure I'll have another question down the road, but thank you.
Yeah, we'll have another chance. Thanks, Commissioner Albertson.
Thanks, Bob. Richard, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, when you say the MSAB is reviewing the 3-year uh, 3-year program. How is that different from the current stock assessment? Full stock assessment is done every 3 years. Is there a difference?
Yes, thanks, Commissioner Yamada. The difference is, well, currently the stock assessment is on a 3-year program of a full stock assessment. Every 3rd year, a full stock assessment is done, where that means, a whole holistic look at all of the inputs into the stock assessment, how the modeling occurs is done every 3rd year. In those years in between, the stock assessment is still done, but we call it more of an update stock assessment, where a lot of the model structure is not considered extensively, and not a lot of changes are made to that, and new data are basically added, which can involve sometimes new concepts of data like sex ratios or update to the maturity curve. This concept of a triennial stock assessment frequency would mean in those update years, a stock assessment would not be done. Thus, a decision table would not be available for the commission to use in their decision making at the annual meeting. Instead, the focus would be on the current trends in the FIS results, the current trends in fishery CPUE, and the reference management procedure would determine the TCY for starting the negotiation and decision making process. That TCY would be determined from the FIS 032 WPUE. And so if the FIS went down 2%, the TCY would also go down 2%, or vice versa.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? No, I think we could move on then, Dave, to 3.5.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. So 3.5 are the reports of the Scientific Review Board meetings that were held in 2024, and there were 2 such meetings, the 24th and 25th session. Unfortunately, the SRB chair is unavailable today, but he's going to be attending the IM100 meeting in Vancouver and present the recommendations and requests for action from the SRB in detail at that meeting. What I would propose we do today is for each of these recommendations, we're going to step through each of these core topics throughout the course of today and tomorrow morning. And then the presenters are going to refer back as appropriate to those recommendations. And so, for example, very shortly, we'll move on to the implementation of the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring, at which point I'll be referencing the SRB recommendations associated with the revision of that program. So unless there are any specific questions related to those recommendations, which the team or I can answer, Chair, I'd suggest we move on to 3.6.
All right, thanks, Dave. I'll just check with commissioners and see if there are any points that they want to raise at this time. I don't see any, Dave. I think we can move on to 3.6.
Great, thank you very much. If we could have the report of the 25th session of the Research Advisory Board on screen, please. Thank you very much. So while I maximize this on screen, just give me a moment. Okay, so provided at Appendix 4 of the Research Advisory Board meeting report are a number of recommendations and requests that arose from the board. Before I jump into those, just a note that this was a modified Research Advisory Board meeting from previous years. In previous years, we tried or attempted to complete all of the work of the board within a single day's meeting. This year, or as a result of last year's request from the Research Advisory Board, we extended that for another half day. And what that allowed us to do is to present the various papers for the Research Advisory Board's consideration, as well as hold some quite lengthy discussions on operational specifics of the work of the Secretariat. It was certainly very well received by the board. which, as I mentioned, was running from the 19th and 20th of November, so last week, prior to the Fish Expo that was held this week. If I step through the recommendations, there were 3 recommendations that were made by the Research Advisory Board. The first 2 relate to the research programs that Dr. Plantis is going to walk us through a little bit later today. And so I'm going to leave those for him to address when he goes through that material. And I forgot the paper number. I think it's 13 off the top of my head. As I mentioned, the RAB really appreciated this extra half day of discussion and presentation and recommended that this continue moving forward. In terms of costs that may result from that, it's actually quite minimal. In previous years, the Research Advisory Board would run from about 9 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we were paying for the accommodation for the board members, or the majority of board members, to stay overnight, fly out the next day. So by extending the board meeting by half a day, there's very little additional cost to the commission. The board made a total of 7 additional requests, and a reminder, these are sort of informal requests to the Secretariat to consider as part of the development of our research activities. This included incorporating AI techniques to supplement the Secretariat's current aging protocol. And so this is something the Commission has also considered over the last year and is aware of. And the Research Advisory Board was very appreciative and supportive of those efforts. There were 3 requests for action related to the 2025 Fishery Independent Setline Survey design. The RAB was supportive of ensuring that the coverage of the design was across all biological regions, and requested that we continue our efforts to seek out supplementary funding to ensure that occurs moving forward. The RAB was also keen to see the Secretariat produce maps showing how long it has been since each of the fish stations were last sampled. And I'm aware that the team is already preparing those maps, and hopefully we might even be able to have those, I think, before the annual meeting circulated, so you'll at least be aware. It's should be a useful assistance tool in developing the designs moving forward. There was also a request from the RAB members for the Secretariat to investigate the feasibility of combining FIS charters, so our annual FIS design, alongside a vessel's commercial quota. And so what that could potentially entail is that if we were to charter a particular commercial vessel to go out and sample for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, that they would be able to tee that up and pair it up with their general operations, whether it be to go out and harvest their IFQ in Alaska waters, just as an example. And what we would need to do there is talk with some of OLE, for example, NOAA, the law enforcement, to see if there are any additional requirements associated with separating catch and the like. So we're a little bit unsure at this point, but it's something that we're going to look into over the next little while. And then finally, there were 3 additional requests on other potential applied research projects. They're just listed there at the moment. There was a high reported incidence of sand fleas throughout the fishery and in more northern areas, I think, in 2024. And so there was a lot of discussion around whether there could be potential climate impacts or other driving forces behind the increase in sand fleas, affecting longline catches and therefore the potential price that's being received. And so we're going to be trying to determine if there's something we can incorporate within the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring as we revise that plan this coming year. And then similarly for Pacific halibut juvenile stages, the RAB was keen to see the Secretariat, including maps of juvenile habitat throughout convention waters, and that's something I know that the team has been working on. And then finally there was quite a bit of discussion around the Secretariat's catch protection research that had been ongoing in the past year or so, and also the efforts that we're trying to make in 2025 and looking at potentially trying to encourage vessels to pair up with doing a fishery independent setline survey work for us, as well as participating in that research project looking at catch protection devices to minimize whale depredation. That's all I have, Chair, regarding the Research Advisory Board report.
All right, thanks very much, Dave. Just looking for the paragraph. It talked about the use of the pink salmon as bait, 50% of the survey in 2024. That's paragraph 26. And it goes on to say that it had mixed results. And as a result, the Secretary would not be moving forward with using pink salmon as an alternative to chum salmon. Or sorry, are you saying that there won't be any more tests with chum and pink?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I might actually pass to Dr. Stewart just to talk a little bit about those results very briefly, and then to provide some clarification. Over to you.
Yeah, and thanks. And this is also outlined in the survey document that's available on the IM website. But the short summary of the results from this year was that pink salmon, although they performed okay in the far east side of the stock, over most of the range, the catch rates were far less than we saw with chum salmon. And so therefore the trade-off of saving money on the bait was more than offset by reduction in catch. So based on those results, unless there were a major change in the price of chum again, I don't think we would anticipate trying to use pinks. Although now that we have standardized, we do have that option in the future if the financial conditions made it such that that might make sense.
So the reduction in catching fish with pink salmon is a concern about harvesting fish for money, or is it because of uncertainty in the outcome results?
Thanks for the question. I would say it's both. With lower catch rates, we had lower sample size for our biological sampling, but then we also had a reduction in revenue. And so all of the things being equal, unless chum salmon were to become much more expensive, I think that we would not recommend using pinks moving forward. Generates less data and less revenue from the survey.
All right, thanks, Ian. I don't know if it's an oversight in the report, but noted there were no Canadian members present.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. And that's actually on my notes to raise at the end of the presentation. Yes, it's been one of the issues that we've had with the Research Advisory Board for a number of years now, and we've made some pretty concerted efforts to recruit Canadian Research Advisory Board members. We were able to recruit an additional last year, but due to other circumstances, she was not able to participate in the meeting this year. And so as you see in the bottom of the report, which is worth noting, is that the two Canadian members were absent with apologies, but we have struggled to find Research Advisory Board members from Canada for quite a while now. And it's something that we're going to continue to work on, but we would really appreciate if delegations were able to reach out, identify potential candidates, and also nominate them if you are aware. At the moment, it's as you can see on the screen, it's even with the two Canadian members, it's a heavily numerically biased board of the commission. So well noted, and we'd appreciate some assistance in that regard. Thanks, Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So are people able to attend these meetings remotely, or is it all in person?
That's correct, Chair. All of the IPHC meetings are run in hybrid format now, and so even if you aren't able to attend in person, you're able to join for part or all of a meeting electronically.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I see questions from two commissioners. Peter first, and then
Yeah, thanks. A couple questions. One in terms of the harvest of IFQ with doing research. I was curious if the idea was to, catch some of their quota while they're doing, while they're doing the set line surveys, or it was the other way around where while they're doing their catching their own quota, they could do one of the set survey design areas. So like, was the priority more on doing a little bit of fishing if you were in that sort of area commercially, or was it to just cover some of the ground while they're doing their own IFQ?
Yeah, thank you for the question through the chair. It was really quite an open-ended question. I think it was quite a robust discussion that we had with the board members about options to try and ensure that we had not only sufficient vessels, but also were more cost-effective in the bids that we could potentially receive from the various vessel captains. And so while it could potentially go either way, I don't think there was a particular push, whether it was going to be doing survey and then adding IFQ, or while you're harvesting your quota that then you could tack on survey. It was really an open-ended discussion. And noting that we do have a lot of uncertainty surrounding what the legal restrictions could be in terms of separating catch. It was very much a conversation that was left open for the Secretariat to go forward and discuss with relevant domestic agencies to determine the feasibility of what it could look like. So no specific path was pushed at the meeting. Thanks, Jay.
Okay, just to follow up on that, I'm just curious in terms of course, there's certain costs that come into play when you're, bait, fuel. Was there any concerns from the Secretariat on how to account for all those kind of costs? Were there any concerns that were brought up because of that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Through the chair, I don't think there necessarily was. Again, it was a matter of at this point just trying to send out some feelers of how it could work, whether these would be separate bids or whether they would be ad hoc bids to add fish stations throughout the season. But otherwise, no, I don't think so. But sorry, I'm just going to pause for a sec. Tyler, was there anything you might want to add from that?
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of discussion about how that would affect us logistically. I think all of the RAB members kind of understood how we would have to have at least one field staff member on the vessel to perform FIS work. So they're having uncertainty to be able to pivot within either an IFQ fishing or go from FIS to IFQ would mean we would have people on board that maybe are getting paid but aren't necessarily taking data. So they understood that, and they also understood how logistically that could cause some problems with flights and things. So as Dave had mentioned, it's right now we're just kind of more in the feasibility aspect of it, and we're kind of going to go from there.
Perfect. Thank you. One other question, and it was to do with recommendation 6. And was this to do like the treaty has specific wording around nursery grounds? Was this to help identify nursery grounds?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm going to pass to Dr. Planos, who leads this area, to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner, for your question. I think the request was mostly intended to provide more information on the level of connectivity between different life stages, so juveniles versus adults. So I think the origin of the question was more related to migration and habitat use.
Okay, so it's not, when you're talking about mapping juvenile habitat, that's not necessarily nursery grounds. That's something else. Sorry.
No, I think you're correct. It is regarding the mapping of the juvenile habitat. That is something that the Secretariat started doing in 2023 with particularly with the IPHC intern at that time. So that was the first attempt that we did to map some of the juvenile habitat areas in Alaska, and the overall plan, as stated in the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring, is to over the years try to expand the information on juvenile habitat throughout conventional waters.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Plantis. And then one sorry about hogging time here, but just on the sand fleas, what do you project you're going to be? There's some interest in Canada around this topic as well. There's been possibly some increased level of sand fleas within our some of our catches, and so I'm curious what you think you're going to be making progress on with this recommendation 5.
Yeah, thank you for your question again, Commissioner DeGrief. The initial steps that we're going to be undertaking are related to the collection of information regarding conditions that may lead to that increased prevalence of sand fleas. So better understanding what information is available today, and then evaluate that to delineate possible future plans. So information collection is the first step.
Okay, thank you very much, guys.
Yes, Paul, I think I have a question to David, maybe Ian, on the Bates decision. It doesn't surprise me that you went away from pink salmon, but I'm wondering, did you have, can you definitively say that chum salmon is X% more productive in catching halibut than pinks, or did you have hooks come back with baits untaken on the pinks bait? What made you make the decision that it was an inferior bait and we should stay with chum?
Sorry, we're just checking to see if we have Dr. Webster online, who might also be able to provide some additional clarification. Ray, are you online? Yes, you are.
Thank you. Just waiting for permission to use the microphone. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
My camera is not active. I'm sorry. Could the question be repeated, please? I missed part of the question.
Yeah, this is Bob, and the question, Ray, is what is there something that pops out on the bait issue between pink salmon and chum? Can you definitively say that chum is X% better in producing halibut than pink? Or did you get baits back on pink that were not taken? Were they just empty hooks because maybe sand fleas got the bait? I know that chum skins tend to stay on the hooks better, even if the meat's gone. What drove you to the conclusion that the chum is the right way to go?
So I'll be addressing this in my presentation later later today in more detail, but I haven't looked at the missing baits in detail. My understanding is, and Tyler can probably speaks more to that we did have more missing baits with pink salmon, which is what we've experienced in the past when we fished these baits. But overall, the catch rates differed by quite a bit, and it varied from area to area. And so, as you'll see in my later presentation, there are some areas where pink salmon did just as well as chum in terms of catch rates. But in most areas, it was at least 10% less, and in some even less than half the catch rate using pink salmon. So it was such a large difference in most places that the cost savings of using pink salmon were outweighed by the reduced catches.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Okay, any other questions? I don't see any. We're okay, Dave, to move on.
Great, thank you very much. The next agenda item then, we don't need to bring up the paper because there's no particular updates. Is related to agenda item 3.7, and this is the IPHC 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. Noting that runs from 2022 to 26. Throughout the course of 2025, we're going to be reviewing and updating the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. And in particular, based on two recommendations that came from the Scientific Review Board this year. And the first of those recommendations was that the SRB recommended that the plan be revised and presented to the SRB at its 26th session early next year to reflect changing priorities in light of major progress on biological research and ongoing monitoring activities or challenges. So this is something that we've already commenced that updating process, but it's not something that's currently ready to be tabled for review. In addition, the SRB has recommended that we incorporate the evaluation of new technologies into the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. And some of the initial examples that the SRB has suggested we incorporate is the testing of otolith samples using AI-generated age compositions in the assessment model as soon as practicable. Also using AI to support aging requirements for gene tagging, such as CKMR, which has been discussed at the SRB for the last number of years. And then finally, looking at epigenetic aging, which would be a new project beginning in 2025, which could provide more reliable and unbiased ages than AI, and perhaps comparable in precision to human-read fish ages. And so that's just something that we're working on broadly across the Secretariat team to go forward and update that 5-year program of research, integrated research and monitoring. Our intention there is to pass that through both SRB meetings next year, and as appropriate, the other subsidiary bodies, in particular the Research Advisory Board. And the intention there is that we would provide you with a revised plan to run from middle of 2026 for the next 5 years for consideration at the interim meeting next year. And that's all I have on this item. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thanks, David. Any questions? Anyone?
Thanks for the update, Dave. I guess maybe just more of an idea that I'd be interested in people's sort of responses to. It seems there are a number of different ideas about where the Secretariat could be pursuing the use of AI. And I just wondered, I mean, my sense is that a lot of things are evolving year by year in terms of what that technology can do. If there's any value in, you know, say, for example, as part of the update on the, like perhaps the research plan, there's a piece of it that sort of touches on, you know, what kinds of projects or ideas are being pursued that make use of this or, I don't know, any other sort of breaking technologies. I think as commissioners, I would be interested in knowing how that is evolving or unfolding and having somewhat regular updates on that. So curious about whether something like that would be possible, if there's a sensible place it could fit.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And through the chair, at present, we have only been looking at it from a fish aging perspective, but the SRB has indicated and suggested that there could be a number of other avenues. But I might pass to Dr. Hutchinsack, excuse me, just to highlight some of those discussions and potential other uses and to address your questions. Over to you, Basha.
Thank you for the question. So yes, as mentioned, we are primarily focusing on the AI using images of otoliths as because we just have a good amount of information available as a input for training. So that's why this was kind of a low-hanging fruit where we could start our efforts and investigate the use of AI. One of the kind of associated with that project suggested by the SRB was to also try to associate captured fish with a region they're coming from, but that is also using AI also with the use of otoliths, but trying to use otoliths not only for input, but also associating these otoliths with a specific area they're coming from. We did not have any further recommendations or requests for investigating use of AI in other areas, but certainly this is something that we could look at and investigate where are the potential future uses. But there's no specific projects that we have currently in line for that.
All right, thanks, Neil. Richard.
Yeah, in the same line of thought of new technologies, have you folks been following, eDNA for stock assessments? Is that something that even is in the realm of the halibut fishery, or is this completely way too far in the future, or not in the area of feasibility?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner Yamada. I think we're certainly aware of the emerging technology around eDNA and the potential for sampling broad areas of the ocean and determining at least species presence absence, if not maybe abundance in some cases. I'd say my read on that technology right now is it's still pretty preliminary, but definitely showing some promise. It's something that we would keep an eye on, but we currently don't have any collaborations planned on that topic just yet, nor anything on our own.
Thank you.
Did that address your question, Richard? Okay.
Well, he answered my question. Thank you.
So, Dave, what I was hearing from you earlier is that over the next year, there will be meetings with the SRB and probably others around the research plan and your ideas that you've come forward. 2025 IM meeting to present a draft of that. Is that what this plan is?
Yes, that's correct, Chair. That's the current plan, yeah.
Okay. I don't see any more hands up, Dave, so I think we can move on now to, I guess it's fishery monitoring.
Right.
Section 4.
Thank you very much, Chair. So yes, agenda item 4 is related to the fishery monitoring activities at the Secretariat, and that is both broken into both fishery dependent monitoring and fishery independent monitoring. And so the first agenda item there is related to our port operations. So agenda item 4.1.1 and specifically paper 07. And Monica Tom, our port operations coordinator, is going to provide that presentation. And so if we could have the PowerPoint for paper 07, please.
Hey, good morning, Commissioners. I'm Monica Tom, and I'm going to talk about IPHC fishery dependent data collection design and implementation for 2024. So our primary objective for port operations and fishery dependent data collection is to collect representative samples from Pacific halibut offloads across the geographical range of the commercial fishery and throughout the commercial fishing period. And that's to provide data for the stock assessment and for the IPHC research goals. And also importantly, to maintain field-based points of contact between the fishing industry and headquarters staff. We have fisheries data specialists, field secretariat in 2 Canadian and 8 Alaskan ports in 2024. An IPHC HQ secretariat. I also went to Newport, Oregon to sample IPHC regulatory area 2A directed commercial openers, the first and second. And also to Bellingham, Washington, to sample IPHC regulatory area 3A, 3B, and a few 2A commercial landings as well in 2024 and the end of 2023. IPHC regulatory area 2A tribal directed commercial data were collected by Washington Treaty Tribes, 9 of which attended our training this year, and we're very happy to facilitate that each year. IPHC HQ Secretariat also assisted the Macaw tribe in Nia Bay, Washington this year. We also have data provided to us by the California, Washington, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this year they were able to collect and mail in logbook data to us. This is just a map showing the ports which we staffed this year with fisheries data specialists field throughout the commercial fishing period. They're still out there right now. Just for your reference. You'll see on this graph in green are the ports that we sampled this year. So we target the ports with the most landings and also high priority data. So you see we got to go to St. Paul this year, which had their local fleet fishing, and we got a lot of good area 4 data. And there's also some ports that we can't sample. So these numbers are data collected as of 17 October 2024, and the collections are ongoing. As I said, they're still in the field out there. Thank you to all of our field staff, some of who are at this meeting today. And I won't read all of these numbers, but in general, we are meeting all our goals in all of areas except for IPHC regulatory area 2A, and that's just due to access to catch being lower. So we do really appreciate the Washington Treaty Tribes assisting in a lot of those data collections. And in area 4A, 4B, 4CDE, we're really tracking our data goals based on a percent landed, but we might not reach our goals over, for 2024. And again, that's just due to access to landings. And we've collected 1,394 logbooks, which are verified. And these are just the logbooks collected by field staff, not the ones mailed in. So the results, the 2024 fishery dependent data collection is still ongoing, underway at this moment. I believe there's some offloads right now. The data processed prior to 30 October of this year will be used and have been used in the 2024 Pacific Halibut Stock Assessment, which Ian will present to you later today. And the data processed after 30 October of this year will be used in next year's stock assessment. Commercial, biological, and catch data interactives, including the 2024 fishery limit reports, which are updated bi-monthly, can be found at that link. And that's it.
And that's all we have, Chair. And any question?
Yeah, I see a question from John.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Monica, for the presentation. So you mentioned whether the port samplers were meeting their goals for frequency or amount of sampling. And I guess a naive question on my part, is there an experimental design that explains the desired frequency of port sampling? I guess what I'm getting at is, are we just sort of doing this opportunistically, or is there some sort of more explicit methodology to explain whether we need to be sending staff to all these ports annually, or what the desired frequency of such sampling is, such as whether we could use a rotational approach or something like that.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Kurland. I will try to answer to the best of my abilities. I work directly with Ray and Ian on this. All at a higher level. I think part of your question was whether or not it's randomized. It is. We target ports with the most landings to maximize our data collections. And the other part of your question, what are our set standards or minimum data goals, and how are those set? I might look to Ray for more specifics. So we have a specific number of minimum otoliths to collect per IPHC regulatory area each year to meet those data standard minimums. And it has always been the data goals to cover the entire fishing period. So spatial and both spatial and temporal goals for our minimums. If you seek further clarification, I can maybe have Ray hop on.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I don't mean to be a pain with the question. It's just the inevitable consideration of budget trade-offs and making sure that we have a strong basis for the amount of field effort. So that's where I was coming from with it. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thank you, John. It would be useful to have a better understanding of the percent target minimums, so just understand how those were arrived at.
Sorry, Chair, you broke up there and we didn't quite understand.
Well, and just following up on John, looking at the slide data collected, slide 6, and so there's a column there that says percent of target minimum, and so it seems to vary across all regulatory areas, and I think it would be helpful for commissioners to understand how those are set. And so I'm not per se looking for an answer right now, but for the future, I think it would be useful to know.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's understood.
I think I can also speak to that a little bit if you would like to, the chair. Part of the reason I put percent landed in is because that kind of explains most of those numbers there. So the percent landed is the percent of the quota that has been landed, and that should in most cases track with the percent target minimum, because we're trying to sample throughout the commercial fishing period to make sure that our data are representative of the entire fishery. And then the percent target minimum is a percentage of the minimum number of otoliths we would ideally collect to support the statistical needs of the data. And so for almost all areas is 1,500 per IPHC regulatory area, and a few less for IPHC regulatory area 2A. And that, again, those number minimums are set by Ray. I hope that answers some of your questions. There's a couple, like I said, that we may or may not reach, and that's due to lower staffing or limited access to landings. And that's IPHC regulatory area 2A, where you can see our percent target of the minimum goal is 50%, but the percent landed is actually 87.7, and that's because we're unable to access those landings. And the rest of them, I think, are kind of tracking.
Yeah, I guess thanks for the explanation. It's still not quite clear how those are set. Don't need to pursue it right now. I think it would be helpful to know, as John points out, having people go around to all these ports does cost money, and it would be good to understand how the targets are set so we can understand what's needed to get the information we're after. John?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I was going to say, Paul. I appreciate your follow-up, and that's where I was coming from as well. So, Dave, I'm not sure what the best means to do this would be, but something to make it a little bit more transparent for the commissioners about kind of the methodology, and I don't know if that gets to sort of statistical power of deciding what the target quantity of otoliths is, or I defer to you on how best to convey the information, but I think you get a sense of where the questions are coming from.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Through the chair, this is something that we can certainly collate and maybe provide either as an intersessional sort of information document briefing note, or if you prefer, we can include a request here from the commission to the secretariat to develop something a little bit more formal that we could also provide for the annual meeting document deadline, which is I think the 28th of December. So it wouldn't take too much work for us to put together the rationale and justification for those sampling rates, targets, and methodologies. And so it's really a question, would you like that just to be provided as a internal briefing note initially, and an update on previous information, or would you like us to provide that as potentially an addendum to this particular paper for the IM100 in January?
Yeah, Paul, I would suggest the latter.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, John.
Thanks, Chair. We'll incorporate that as a request or even a recommendation from the commission. And we'll implement that by the document deadline.
All right, thanks very much. I think we can carry on to, I guess it's 4.12.
Right. Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks, Monica. And so the next is agenda item 4.1.2 on the fisheries data activities. And I'm going to pass to Dr. Hutchinson to walk you through paper 08 Rev 2. So if we could have the presentation up for that, please. Over to you, Basha.
Yes, thank you and good morning, commissioners. If the secretariat could also make me a presenter. Thank you very much. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the 2024 Pacific halibut removals, including the status of mortality reported against fishery limits adopted by the Commission and outlined in the IPHC fishery regulations. Data provided in this presentation is projected through the end of the fishing season as of 1st of November and includes the projections to 7th of December, so the end of the commercial season for the commercial sector. As a reminder, as Monica also mentioned, in-season updates are provided on a regular basis on the 1st and 15th of each month at the IPHC website in the fishery limits report. So overall projected mortality for 2024 is a little bit over 14,000 tons or a little over 31 million pounds, which represents 88% of the coast-wide TCEY. I'll go now through specific regions and sector to provide additional details. For the non-treated directed commercial fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 2A, the fishery estimated removals are at 95% of the fishery limit, or 108 tons, or 240,000 pounds. For Treaty Indian directed commercial fishery, the estimated removals are at 98% of the fishery limit, 220 tons, or a little bit under 500,000 pounds. As a reminder, non-directed commercial fishery was performed over 5 50-hour-long fishing periods, and Treaty Indian directed commercial fisheries managed through a combination of unrestricted and restricted openers, which varied by tribe. For the incidental commercial landings with salmon trawl fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 2A, this fishery was managed through a management measure of 1 Pacific halibut per 2 Chinook plus 1 additional fish with maximum of 35 fish per trip. Estimated removals are at 79% of the fishery limit, 16 tons or 30,000 pounds. For the incidental commercial landings with sablefish fishery, this fishery was open from 1st of April with a management measure of 130 pounds of Pacific halibut for every 1,000 pounds of sablefish, plus 2 additional fish. And on 22nd of October, this measure was changed to 150 pounds of Pacific halibut for every 1,000 pounds of sablefish. Estimated removals in this fishery are at 79% of the fishery limit, 18 tons or 40,000 pounds. For the commercial fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 2B, the quota share fishery, estimated removals are at 95% of the fishery limit, 2,046 tons or a little bit over 4.5 million pounds when projected through the end of the commercial fishing period. For IPHC regulatory areas 2C to 4, covering entire Alaska, for the directed commercial fishery or quota share fisheries, the estimated removals are at 80% of the fishery limit. That is 6,735 tons or 14.85 million pounds. This fishery also comprises of Annette Island reserve fisheries that landed 17 tons or 40,000 pounds. The plots here show cumulative attainment of the limits by directed commercial fishery, and as you can see, the 2024 is represented by a black line. And in terms of the percent of the fishery limit attained, this commercial fishery closely traced the last few years. You can see in terms of percentage, you can see that on the left plot. but it's below the last 3 years in terms of attainment of the limit in terms of the actual volume in those fisheries. It's below last 3 years. Moving to other sectors, in terms of recreational fishery in IPHC regulatory area 2A, estimated removals are at 85% of the fishery limit, or 235 tons, or a little over 500,000 pounds. For California, this translates to 62% of the fishery limit, for Oregon, 72% of the fishery limit, and in Washington, 101% of the fishery limit. For recreational fishery in IPHC regulatory area 2B, Canada, this fishery estimated removals are at 97% of the fishery limit, at 365 tons, or 810,000 pounds. As a reminder, this fishery had an early closure on 9th of October. This fishery also catch, in addition to that recreational limit, some of the allocation through experimental recreational quota program. And under this program, the estimated removals are at 9 tons or 20,000 pounds. For recreational fishery in IPHC regulatory areas 2C to 4, covering Alaska, this recreational fishery in this area is split between unguided sector and guided sector. For unguided sector, estimated removals are at 91% of the fishery projection, 861 tons or 1.9 million pounds. For the guided sector, the estimated removals are at 91% of the fishery limit, 1,111 tons or 2.45 million pounds. And this is exactly 91% for both of the sectors. Same. This fishery also had some additional allocation for the guided anglerfish program, under which estimated removals are at 70 tons or 150,000 pounds. Estimated removals for the subsistence fisheries in all IPHC regulatory areas are estimated at 100% of the fishery limit or projection. And this is in total 375 tons or 830,000 pounds. For the non-directed commercial discount mortality overall for all IPHC regulatory areas, estimated removals are at 81% of the fishery projection, 1,055 tons or 2.33 million pounds. The next, we have table here that compares the mortality estimates reported against fishery limits and mortality projections by IPHC regulatory areas. And you can see here the percent attained varied quite substantially between IPHC regulatory areas, between 35% in IPHC regulatory area 4B to 100% in IPHC regulatory area 2B. Overall, as I mentioned at the beginning, the projected attainment of the TCY is at 88%, which is just slightly below the attainment of the TCY last year, which was 89%. The table here compares mortality estimates against fishery limits and projections by sector, and this also varied between 81% for the non-directed commercial discard mortality and 100% for the subsistence fishery. Again, this is by sector. And this ends my presentation with just a note that the recommendation from the Secretariat is to note this paper revision 2 that provides the Commission with a preliminary overview of the 2024 Pacific halibut removals. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Peter, see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Basha. one question is in regards to when do you make your projections? I think from the previous slide, it had mentioned October 17th. So is everything projected to the end of the year from October 17th? Or are you using more current data for these projections? I only note that within our, like the numbers differ very much from what DFO has done through our ITQ program, which just looking at it briefly, we have roughly 12% of our TAC remaining in the commercial fishery. So just curious if you're projecting from October 17th or if you're using more current data.
Thank you, Commissioner Grieve, for the question, for the chair. So these data are projected. So we do collect the data through about mid-October, and we do make projections on November 1st. So these are the projections as of November 1st, using the data available to us at the time, plus any projected harvest from November 1st to the end of the season. This is because we do want to align what we present here in this presentation with what the specific information is going into the stock assessment. And stock assessment deadline is end of October, and we use the best information that is available to us at the time.
Okay, just a short follow-up in terms of, so I appreciate that because the deadline for that was October 30th, as described in the last slide or the last presentation. Are you using like past historical trends, or what kind of trends are you using to use these projections? I assume you're just using maybe what happened last year, or using what happened the previous 5 years. Just curious, because I note that the last couple of years, it seems like things, when they rallied out after October 30th, they were somewhat different.
Thank you for this follow-up question, Commissioner Grieve, and again for the chair. So what we're using is for every regulatory area, we make projections only for the commercial sector. Other sectors are provided as projected by specific agencies. For the commercial sector, we use last 2 years, 60 days prior the projection day, plus the current last 2 years from 60 days before the projection day to the end of the season, plus the current year, 60 days before the projection. And we make that projection moving forward using a polynomial of degree 3 as a function that is shifted to match the current state and projected forward to the current opening date to match the specific number of days that is left in the fishery. So again, so it's a trend from the last 60 days to the end of the season, covering the last 2 years plus the current year.
Okay, thank you. So okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Peter. I don't see any other hands up action. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
So Dave, I think we're at a scheduled break, are we not?
Yeah, we're right on time, Chair. Thank you. And so before we move on to the fishery independent data overview, if we could break for 15 minutes and then come back at 10:45, that would be ideal. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. See you at 10:45.
Thank you.
We're ready here, David. Can you hear me okay? Is this volume okay?
Yeah, this is perfect. Thank you. Yeah, we're having a bit of challenge before the break, but that's a good volume. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thanks. John, you ready to go?
Ready to go. Thanks.
Okay. All right, then let's move on to item 4.2.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Tyler Jack, the acting Setline Survey Coordinator, is going to present this, noting that Kayla Ulesi is currently on parental leave. And so if we could have the presentation up for paper 09, that would be great. Thank you very much. And over to you, Tyler. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, commissioners. Today I'll be discussing the 2024 IPHC Fishery Independent Set Line Survey Design and Implementation. So as a reminder, our primary objective on the FIS is standardized fishery independent data collection for the Pacific halibut stock assessment and stock distribution estimations. Consistent sampling at stations year after year over the extended time series provides an invaluable foundation for identifying trends in Pacific halibut distribution and abundance. Biological sampling further supports understanding of the dynamic population by providing data on sex, maturity, and age. In the 2024 FIS, both gear and bait are standardized as they are every year. And the FIS provides relative abundance indices critical for stock assessment models. Standardization ensures that these indices accurately reflect changes in the population rather than artifacts of the survey methodology. Calibration studies in previous years has once again allowed us to open the bid process to both fixed and snap gear vessels. However, in 2024, only fixed gear vessels participated. And as most of you already know, skate length, number, and spacing of hooks, as well as hook type and size, are all standardized. For the first time in 2024, we use both frozen chum salmon and pink salmon in an attempt to compare and calibrate relative bait success. These baits must be number 2 semi-bright or semi-bright or better, and individual baits must be cut to 1/4 to 1/3 of a pound. Captains and field staff are required to inspect and ensure the bait is up to our strict standards, and the captains must sign off on bait quality. Here's a map showing the 2024 set line survey. The orange dots that you see there are what represent the stations that were planned to be fished in 2024. And as you can see, this season's design was significantly reduced with only 525 stations, as opposed to 958 in 2023, 1,188 in 2022. And this season went from the 24th of May to the 15th of August, ending a little bit earlier due to that reduced design, as opposed to 2023 and 2022, where it ran to the beginning of September and the middle of September, respectively. This season, we had 5 vessels participating versus the 8 that participated in each of the prior 2 seasons. This table provides a breakdown of the various types of ineffective stations we encountered in 2024, noting that there were 15 stations deemed ineffective. As per usual, the majority of these stations were deemed ineffective due to whale depredation. As you can see from the orange dots on the map, 9 stations were victim to sperm whales. 3 of those were in 2B, as you can see on the northwest end of the Haida Gwaii in the south. And then we had 6 clustered in 2C on the south end of Baranof Island. We also had a pair deemed ineffective out in 4CDE, represented by those 2 blue circles. And those were due to orca depredation. And we also had a few ineffective stations that were not due to whale depredation. And that included the one station you see there in red. That was due to gear issues that were no fault of the vessel. And we also had 3 stations up there in the inside waters of 2C that were deemed ineffective due to sand fleas. So as you saw on the last slide, we had 15 total stations that were deemed ineffective. How did we do when we compare to previous years? So this graphic provides a visual representation of the percentage of stations in a given year's design that were deemed ineffective starting in 1998 to 2024. And that navy blue color represents whale depredation. As you can see, it's generally the predominant reason why stations are deemed ineffective, particularly when we fish in Area 4, and more specifically when we fish in Area 4A, because that has the highest percentage of ineffective stations. So we would expect to have a lower total number of ineffective stations in years that we do not sample in that area. And we did not perform work in the FIS in 4A in 2020, 2023, or this past year in 2024. Also of note, we had some discussion about this earlier, but there was a significant increase in sand fleas coastwide, but especially in 3A and 3B. However, only the 3 stations that I pointed out and 2C in the last slide in those inside waters were actually met our criteria to deem them ineffective. The secondary objective in the FIS is currently long-term revenue neutrality. If money were not an option, we would of course prefer to have the FIS design that had a completely comprehensive coastwide footprint. But we realize that isn't currently feasible, and as a result, the size and breadth of the FIS design is highly dependent on getting the most out of our dollar. And Dr. Webster will discuss this more on the next presentation. So we strive to meet this objective through a number of measures to reduce costs and increase revenue. This is achieved in our fish sale process, where a request for tender is sent to all interested buyers that are able to purchase fish in a given port to ensure that we get competitive pricing. All bids are rated against specified criteria provided to all interested buyers on the sales notice, and we have established controls for review and approval for each sale. Starting in 2023, we opened bids to multiple ports to increase our options and take advantage of the best local price available. This is particularly effective in Southeast Alaska, where there can be significant discrepancies in prices from port to port. When contracting vessel charter agreements, we follow a similar approach by submitting them to a bid process, where all submissions are rated against specified criteria published in tender specifications. We further strive to meet this secondary objective of revenue neutrality through the sale of sampled U32 Pacific halibut. So these are fish that have already been sacrificed for science. And on average, our price is about 19% less than legal size fish. The tertiary objective of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is scientific collaboration. In 2024, we took Pacific cod and spiny dogfish measurements in collaboration with NOAA Fisheries. In the past, we've collaborated in 2B in a dockside rockfish sampling program with DFO, Archipelago, and PHMA. That was put on hold for 2024. In years that we fish in Washington, we collaborate with WDFW and NOAA to fish rockfish index stations, and we participate in dockside rockfish sampling. That too was put on hold in 2024 due to a reduced design that did not include Area 2A this year. And this slide provides a link to our website where you can find the 2024 FIS results as well as results from previous seasons. So as I mentioned earlier, the size of the FIS footprint in subsequent years is highly dependent on proceeds from fish sales. The state of the FIS mostly hinges on 2 variables that we have very little control over: how much fish we catch and prices. In a revenue neutral model, we want more FIS coverage, we need to catch more fish and or have better prices. So as we look forward to 2025, we need to evaluate how we did on this second objective of revenue neutrality. In this graph, you can see what we actually caught in the navy blue color in 2024 compared to the catch the last time that those same stations were fished. Now, any discrepancies between these totals are important because when we budget for a specific year's design, we use previous catch totals to help inform the revenue simulation. So when you consider this graphic, I want to point out that this is purely raw catch data that has not been corrected for things like bait competition or bait type. And in some instances, some of these stations haven't been fished in many, many years. So this should not be confused for actual catch rates in the FIS index. Also, this graph here includes vessel captain stations that took place in 2B and 2C, where for each full day of fishing, captains were allowed to replace one station on the grid with a nearby location of their choice, thought to have either better catch rates or had some sort of advantage in efficiency. So you can really see overall that we caught 88% coastwide, less poundage coastwide compared to 2023. Though this coastwide total was substantially aided by the success of vessel captain stations in 2B and 2C, and you can really see the effect from vessel captain stations when you compare this slide to the next. So if you pay attention to 2B and 2C specifically, and we go to the next slide, you can really see the effect that the vessel captain stations had. These records do not include the vessel captain stations from 2B and 2C. As made evident in the huge discrepancy between the two graphs, fishermen left to their own devices are really good at finding fish. And when you exclude vessel captain stations from the overall catch, we had only caught 69% coastwide of the catch as compared to last time these stations were fished on the FIS. So now that we've considered catch, the other side of the revenue equation is price. This table shows the average price per pound USD by IPHC regulatory area as compared to average price in 2023. Now, the 2023 records have been inflation adjusted to provide a consistent basis for comparison. So I won't read line by line, but I would like to point out the lines corresponding to IPHC regulatory area 2B and 2C, where we get most of our landings. And you can see that there is a significant price drop from 2023. In 2023, we had $8.03 versus 2024, $7.26  2B. And in 2C, we had $6.23 in 2023 versus $5.96 in 2024. So if you go down to the coastwide totals, when you consider those, you can see that prices stayed more or less consistent from 2023. Coastwide, we earned $6 in 2022 and $6.22 in 2024 and $6.19 in 2023. This graphic provides a look at the average price pattern beginning in 2000 to 2024. You can see quite a bit of fluctuation over the years, but looking at this, I think it is important to note that despite operating costs going up, if you go to the end here, the prices the last two seasons seem to be pretty sticky and have yet to rebound to pre-pandemic levels. Pacific halibut sales by regulatory area. In 2023, we earned just under $3,200,000 from fish sales, as compared to this year where we earned almost $22,100,000 in Pacific halibut sales. And an overall decrease in this sales revenue isn't a huge surprise, considering that we only fished 55% of the total stations we fished in 2023. Some 2024 highlights. The FV Kimasu shouldered all of the work in areas 3A and 3B, completing 169 stations in the charter region of Albatross, Shelikof, and Trinity, and had 0 stations deemed ineffective. Also of note, we had a low percentage of ineffective stations with only 2.87% this year compared to 3.25% in 2023 and 4.96% in 2022. So of the 525 stations planned, we had the 15 stations that were deemed ineffective, and then we had 3 stations that were unable to be fished due to locations in protected areas. And that was 2 stations in, or 1 station in a protected area in St. James and 2 stations in Glacier Bay National Park. So of the 525 stations total, we completed 507 stations effectively. "2024 FIS also had some challenges. We had poor catch in all regulatory areas when you excluded vessel captain stations. And for another year, we had unfavorable prices. While overall coastwide average price was slightly higher than in 2023 by 2 cents, pricing in higher catch areas of 2B and 2C were still lower than last year. And that concludes my report on the 2024 fish. I can take any questions.
Okay, all right, questions on, Peter?
Yeah, thank you. In terms of laced, how do you determine a set is ineffective due to lice? Is there some proportion of the catch that was laced, or is it 100%? I'm just curious.
Thank you, Commissioner DeGrief. That's a great question. This is something that we've discussed a lot over the years, especially since we have we've been seeing a bit of an increase in sand fleet fish. We currently have a protocol includes that we actually have to see fish falling off of the line as they're coming out of the water. So we have an idea that essentially we're saying that the actual catch isn't representative of what's being caught because of sand fleas. Now, we know that there's fish that are likely coming off the hooks before they come out of the water. So we do allow for our field staff to take notes in those cases, and then we can come back with the QSI branch and kind of discuss what we think what we think can be done with those stations and if we think they should be deemed ineffective. However, we do account for sand fleet fish in basically how many baits are being actually fished, because we also are counting in our 20th account the amount of baits that are coming back on the hooks. Now, if we have baits that are coming off due to them being sand fleet, that will be represented in the model. So we don't want to take, in many cases, it is being accounted for. But in cases where maybe we have really, really extreme sand fleet cases, like those ones I pointed out to see, where we're actually seeing them fall off the line before they break the water, in those cases, we are deeming them ineffective. And it would be difficult to change this criteria at this point because you'd have to go back and change it through the whole entire time series for the FIS. So it makes it kind of hard to make any changes because that's the way we've always looked at it. But we, like I said before, we do allow for field staff, given the latitude, to be able to take a bunch of notes, and then we can kind of have a discussion about it.
Okay, thanks for that. I appreciate that. That helps my understanding a lot, Tyler. One question then, do you have anything that is, for instance, marketable versus unmarketable? Like you bring it about board, you measure it, maybe you take the otolith, I don't know, probably easier to get, but you know, like, is there a marketable versus unmarketable fish?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. There is fish that sometimes come on board that are just carcasses, and we can still get some biological information from that. So we can still get a length, and that length will have the weight that gets derived from the length weight instead of our actual weights that we're getting. And also we can get otoliths, like you said. Sometimes it is a bit easier to get an otolith from a fish that barely even has a head left. But yes, we do deem them in the database as not kept. And we also, every fish that comes up that has sand fleas that are actually has gotten into the body, so through the eyeballs, and could somehow affect maybe its mortality once released, those are all deemed with a comment code of S as well, which stands for sand fleas. So we we do have data on the number of sand fleet fish that are coming on board. So I think that's something that maybe going forward, we can look back to the time series and see how prevalent sand fleet fish are across the time series and see if there's an increase in the database.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested to see how much money we're losing to sand fleas, and if there's anything we can do in terms of shortening time soaks or anything like that to, remediate that problem. Okay, thank you very much, Tyler.
Thank you.
Richard.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Just refresh my memory. How do these ineffective stations feed into any kind of economic forecast of productivity of the fish, as well as how does it feed into the stock assessment? Second of all, since we only fished like half of or 55% of the stations, with that number of whale predation, and especially like in 2C and 2B, where we fished a lot of stations for economic reasons. How does that balance out with years that we fished, 900 stations? Is there like a ratio or an adjustment made that feed into these models?
Yeah, so for that, your second part of the question there, we do certainly, we're basically looking at, we're comparing the last time those stations were fished when we're simulating for all our new models. So I think specifically for how the model interprets those, I might have to defer to maybe Ian or Ray. But for your first part of the question, can you remind me what the first part you broke up a little bit there?
Yeah, I wanted to know how these things feed in, or how important is this predation? Where does this feed in? This data that you get from whale or sand fleas feed into what model, and how important is that in these models? And is it in a stock assessment model or just an economic productivity model somehow? So that the amount of revenue you're generating has been affected by some whale predation. So what models does this data feed into that's important?
Yeah, so specifically for the stock assessment models, anytime that we've had any type of whale depredation or any case we have an ineffective station, that could be due to gear loss or something, those models those stations won't be included in that year's stock assessment. We do still get biological data from those specific stations, so we can still have ages and weights and things like that. But those stations we are assuming aren't representative of the actual catch at those stations. So in an area where you might get a lot of whale depredation, there could be a significant part of that charter region that isn't being there. Those numbers aren't directly being input, and you're having to use more of the spatio-temporal model to fill out those blank spots. As far as the how it's being considered economically, I don't think it's necessarily going into the economic models. The fish that we're still catching on those stations, whether or not we're getting more or less, or we're getting less, we're still taking to the dock and still selling those models, or still selling those fish. So I'm not sure exactly how we account for those in the model.
I guess the second part of my question was, since we're fishing a lot less in 2024 than we did in 2023, how is that adjusted in the inputs or in your graphs showing the impact of whale predation or, the ineffective stations. How do you balance that impact when you got less stations being fished and say 6 whales predated with one station, and then the next year you got half the stations, but you still got 6 whales predating?
Right. So that's why we like to instead use percentage of ineffective stations. So in this one here, we're actually displaying the percentage of stations that were deemed ineffective. It's percentage of stations compared to the percentage of stations compared to the total number of stations. So yeah, that's why we try to use the percentage here when we're trying to visualize it that way. So you can kind of see it makes more sense because it's the number of stations that are fished are changing every year. So just the percentage of the total number of stations, I think, is a better way of visualizing it. But we do have to include the caveat that area 4A, when that regulatory area is included, will have usually more ineffective stations due to both tides and whale depredation. So that's one thing to consider when looking at this. But other than that, that's why we try to kind of use this percentage rather than just total.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I don't see any more hands up, so we can now move next to agenda item 5.1.
Thanks very much. So agenda item 5.1 will be presented by Dr. Webster. And so if we could have the presentation for his paper, please. And he's presenting remotely as well. Over to you, Dr. Webster.
Thank you, and good morning, commissioners and everyone else. This is a relatively short presentation on the output of the space-time modeling for 2024. Much of the material in this presentation will be represented with more context relative to the assessment by Dr. Stewart later on. So as we've done in previous years, we use space-time modeling to estimate the indices of density and abundance, so 32 and all sizes weight per unit effort and all sizes numbers per unit effort. Let's see, I can do that. Where was I? And for IPHC regulatory areas 4A and 4CD, the modeling uses data also from agency troll surveys, NIMS and Alaska Department of Fish and Game, who have a troll survey in Northern Sound. And we use a calibration to convert troll data to the FIS equivalent based on 2 years in which the surveys overlapped in 2006 and 2015. Other areas use only the FIS data, and the raw station data are adjusted for hook competition and timing of the FIS relative to the fishery. The models predict weight and numbers per unit effort at all grid stations, whether they were surveyed in a given year or not. And estimates are calculated as averages across station predictions. So when we calculate an estimate for a given year for a region or for a biological, for an area, a biological region or coastwide, we are using values at all of the stations, regardless of whether they were fished. So we have an estimate that's consistent from year to year in terms of spatial coverage. Lack of sampling or reduced sampling is reflected in greater uncertainty. You'll see that in some of those in the coming figures. We get official estimates for biological regions, regulatory areas, and the IPHC convention waters from San Francisco Bay to the Bering Strait. And the station level output is supplied to the online IPHC Spacetime Explorer tool, which is available on our website. So first, 32 weight per unit effort by biological region. These are the trends since we started doing the modern survey in 1993. The numbers in the bottom left of each panel shows the estimated change in this index from 2023 to 2024. So overall, the coastwide index was estimated to have declined by 9%, and with some variation among regions. The largest decline driving that coastwide decline was in Region 3. You'll note that in a region like 4B, we had no sampling this year, and we had no sampling last year, or the year before. And so the shaded region in region 4B in particular is getting wider, which indicates increasing uncertainty in that index. And essentially, the index could have gone up by quite a lot. It could have gone down by quite a lot. What we estimate is 4%, but really we don't know what's going on in a region like 4B, given the lack of survey in recent years. All sizes, weight, pure, and effort by biological region. Well, the survey is catching a larger number of smaller fish, so this index has decreased by less coastwide than the 032 index. Only 2% decrease coastwide, and smaller decreases or changes in the regional values as well. Numbers per unit effort, we actually estimated a 3% increase in the coastwide index, and generally increases in most areas, most regions as well. So as discussed previously and raised by Commissioner Alverson, we fished two types of bait this year, pink salmon and chum salmon, according to this design, which we presented at the annual meeting earlier in the year. 50% of stations in all areas were chum, 50% were pink, and they were spaced in this sort of grid fashion so that they each provided, each bait was providing similar coverage within those sampled regions. So the model output shows that estimates of the ratio of pink to chum salmon catch rates is almost always less than 1, implying that pink salmon baits had lower catch rates than standard chum salmon baits. The ratios generally declined from east to west, and the official model output is standardized to chum salmon baits so that we're, there is not an impact on the official model results and the indices that you just saw by having some of the stations fished with pink salmon this year. That's adjusted, basically standardized within the models. And so we can see for 032 weight per effort, these are the ratios. So a ratio of 1 means that the catch rate between the two baits was the same. And only in 2C for 032 weight per unit effort do we get an estimated ratio of 1. Although even for the other indices in 2C, the values in parentheses indicate the 95% intervals for those estimates. So we're 95% sure that the estimate, say for 2C, for 2C, in this ratio is between 0.81 and 1.27. If those intervals include 1, then it's possible that there was still no difference in baits, even if we estimated a value that was different. There's a lot of uncertainty. But generally, we have the closest values for 2C, a little bit lower for 2B, and decreasing ratios as we move further west, with 4CD having ratios of less than 0.5, as I noted earlier, and down to about a third for all sizes, weight per unit effort, numbers per unit effort. So the bait had a significant impact on catch rates. The use of pink salmon generally decreased catch rates, which is why it's not economically effective to use this in future surveys. It would have to be a much greater cost savings for it to be a viable alternative. I will also note that these catch rates are adjusted for the timing and competition, as I mentioned before, and do not necessarily match the raw catch rates or differences in the raw catch rates. So the economic impact may be slightly different from what's implied here. Vessel captain stations were also used in IPHC regulatory areas 2B and 2C this year. And so to summarize or to recap on what those are, when fishing 3 or more stations a day, vessel captains could choose to switch out a fish station for one set located off the grid that has a higher expected catch rate. As well as potentially increasing revenue, running time between sets could also be reduced. As a one-year measure, we did not expect initially this to introduce bias in the estimates. Predictions are still made at the grid station locations. Whatever the captain did, wherever they moved those locations to fish, we're still making our predictions for the creation of those indices at the original location. And so given that values are highly correlated from one year to the next, if we were to fish that station in 2023, we thought that would be the most influential information on what that station was predicting in 2024. And as a check, we fitted models with and without data from vessel captain stations. And it turned out, with respect to the bias, that our assumptions was incorrect. And the concerns of a lot of folks that were expressed at the RAB last year and at the annual meeting were valid, that the inclusion of the vessel captain stations did introduce bias into the estimates of O32 weight beam effort and all sizes weight beam effort. And as Tyler mentioned earlier, the vessel captains are very good at finding places to get higher catch rates. And they, to the point where with the stations included, we got catch rates for up to 13% higher than we did if we excluded the data from the vessel captain stations. Even though those stations weren't at the same locations as where we're predicting, they were influential enough on the locations at which we're predicting to impact the catch rates. So the mean vessels of all sizes, numbers, beam effort, however, were almost the same with and without vessel captain station data. That implies the captains were able to target locations with larger Pacific halibut rather than locations with greater numbers of fish. And so the official model output was produced without data from vessel captain stations to avoid bias. And so here's the summary of those catch rates with 95% intervals to give a measure of uncertainty. So this was only done in 2B and 2C, as I mentioned. So if we look at, here's a pointer here. If we look at the catch rate in 2B, O32, this is the modeled catch rate, O32 weight per unit effort with vessel captain station was 70.5 pounds per skate. Without vessel captain stations, 62.2 pounds per skate. And we had likewise higher catch rates with vessel captain stations for all values of weight per unit effort, all sizes, and O32. But with all sizes numbers per unit effort, the values for with and without vessel captain stations are virtually identical. And the recommendation is simply that the Commission note the accompanying paper. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Ray. Any questions? Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. One question I have, and it's because of vessel captain station. So you say you haven't used them due to bias. So that means they're completely, the data is just not inputted anywhere, or is it used somewhat spatially in the model to say what could be between two stations, for instance, if that's where the station was? So was it completely discounted or not?
So the official output does not include those data. So even though those stations, those vessel captain locations were in some cases between stations, sometimes there was some distance away from stations were fished in an inlet. They might have moved the vessel captain station out of the inlet or grouped it with other stations. Those stations are not included because even if it turns out the captains were very good at finding localized spots of higher, of larger fish on average. And so including that data biased the results. And that's true also because of the size differences. Dr. Stewart did not use the biological data from those stations in the stock assessment either. Now we still have quite comprehensive spatial coverage within IPHC regulatory areas 2B and 2C. If we look at maps of the coverage, which I'm not sure I have available right now, but you'll see that the areas that are well covered by the stations, even if up to 1/3 of those of the data we collected are missing. So essentially, what we got out of this was some better understanding of the impact of doing something like this on the data, but we also had it allowed us to increase the revenue for 1 year. It is not something that we're looking for continuing with in the future because of those concerns about a bias.
Okay, thanks. One thing I'll note, so you mentioned, do you have any idea what proportion of the fish was caught in these captain stations overall in 2B or 2C?
In terms of the numbers of fish, I mean,
or the volume of fish. I'm just thinking for You noted that they caught bigger fish. Well, when you catch bigger fish that time of year, I know there's a very strong market difference between large fish and small fish, and so that might actually reflect in the pricing of your average price as well. Like if we had delivered what maybe traditionally would have been caught, we might see even lower prices due to not having that proportion of a fish being large, which generally you pay. They pay well over $1 more, for different sizes, so for larger fish.
Okay.
It's just something to consider when you're looking at pricing. Is that these fish were obviously bigger. You're going to get paid more for bigger fish, and so that would influence what your average price was.
That's a fair point, and that should be something we take into account when trying to predict what catch rates are for 2025 and so on. When we make those projections on the cost of designs.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. That's all.
I have a question. You go back to slide 8. You were doing the comparisons between pink and chum. It's quite a range. It ranges from basically 50% to equivalent to chum. I guess, were you expecting that kind of range, or do you have any rationale for why? It seems pretty large to me.
Yeah, so we did an experiment in 2012 comparing pink and chum and one other.
Sorry, I can't hear you, right?
I'm sorry. My microphone's on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, people are nodding. Okay, I'll try to speak closer to the microphone. We did an experiment in 2012 comparing pink and chum and an additional bait. And we found then that there were spatial differences, quite large spatial differences in the catch rates and other quantities, such as numbers of missing baits and so on, between the baits. And so it wasn't a surprise that we were getting spatial differences in the ratio of pink to chum. Perhaps the size of the differences out in 4CD was larger than was indicated by the 2012 study. But we've talked a little bit about this, and one working theory is that this reflects perhaps Pacific halibut's access to these fish as prey in the different parts of the stock. So if they're more familiar with pink salmon as a desirable prey item, perhaps in the southeast of the stock, maybe there's more pink salmon available there than there are out west, then they will be more attracted to those baits in regions like 2B and 2C than they are in 4CD.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. I forgot about that experiment back in 2012. Any other questions for Rick? Here.
Yeah, just on this, like you mentioned, availability of, what they're feeding on in the moment, but it's been my experience that it's also a softer bait. It doesn't soak as long, so maybe soak time has some sort of something to do with why these change over time. So areas where you need to soak your gear longer, maybe you're less likely to, the bait's not there as long.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, Ray. Thanks very much. So it's 11:30. David, do we want to move on to 5.2?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So agenda item 5.2 is paper 11, Rev 1. And so we could have that presentation brought up. Dr. Stewart will lead us through. Thanks, Chair. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, good morning. I'm going to present to you the overview of data sources for this year, as well as the results of this year's stock assessment. I'll note before I begin that as we did last year, we've separated this presentation into two parts. This first part will constitute the data and the basic stock assessment results. You'll then hear from Dr. Hicks, and then I will follow up with the harvest decision table and 3-year projections. So this presentation that you'll hear first will not include that additional information on the harvest decision table and projections. I'll begin with a broad overview of the results. Despite the lower TCEY set for 2024, we did see fishing mortality increase slightly from 2023. In both the fishery and the fishery independent setline survey, we continue to see a shift from older to younger fish. And this was, again, very pronounced in this year's data, as I'll show you in a few minutes. We estimate from this year's stock assessment that the spawning biomass is lower than we estimated last year. And finally, it is becoming clear that the stock remains at a low productivity level due to both low weighted age as well as low recruitment, now estimated all the way through 2016. So in aggregate, this provides a relatively pessimistic result this year. We see that the trends overall and the stock productivity remain down, and that's likely to continue to be the case for several years. I'll go now through the specific information that allows us to draw those conclusions. So I'll begin with the various data sources, and then I'll continue into the modeling. And depending on where this presentation lines up, maybe we'll break for lunch in between those two sections. Okay, to recap the historical mortality information, this is a graphic showing you the mortality from fishing from all the various fishery sectors back into the 1960s. You'll recall that we had the 100-year peak in mortality on this stock occurred in the early 2000s, and that was a combination of the directed commercial fishery here shown in green, the recreational sector, non-directed discard mortality or bycatch, and all the other sectors that are apparent there at that peak. The mortality came down as the commission reduced catch levels from that time in the early 2000s until about 2013. Since then, we've had more stability in the overall mortality. However, we've seen a slow decrease from just over 40 million pounds to a little bit under 40 million pounds over the last decade. Now, I'm going to show you a broad summary of the mortality. You heard from Dr. Huszczak, the most up-to-date information. You'll note that the numbers that she presented may differ slightly from what you see in the stock assessment, where updates have become available since we closed the data sets at the end of October. This first table shows you what we projected from last year's annual meeting. So based on the mortality limits that were adopted last January, this is the mortality that we projected would occur from those mortality limits, with the total mortality projected to be just under 37 million pounds, including all sources and sizes of Pacific halibut. When we summarize the data this year for this year's stock assessment, recalling the earlier conversation that where fisheries are still occurring, this includes a projection through to the end of the calendar year, we see that we've come in slightly below in aggregate where we thought we might be at the end of the year. In total, almost 1.5 million pounds lower. The commercial landings projected to be slightly lower. I'll highlight two columns here. The first is the second column of commercial discards. This is primarily fish that are less than 32 inches that are captured, discarded, and end up dead. As a function of that, we saw a fairly sizable increase there, up to 1.5 million pounds of discard mortality in the directed commercial fishery in 2024. This is consistent with the continued encounters of smaller and smaller fish in the directed commercial fishery, some of which are above the 32-inch minimum size limit and some of which are below. The other place I would call your attention is the second to last column of non-directed discards or bycatch. You'll note that we projected forward a value of 4.42 million pounds. That was projected based on the 3-year running average through 2023. This year, we estimate that that value has dropped to 4.11 million pounds in 2024. And if we recalculate the 3-year average, we would get a value of 4.5 million pounds. And that's because we've just dropped one of the lowest values in the series that occurred 3 years ago, or the lowest value in the series, which occurred 3 years ago. Recalling that this was a decision by the Commission in 2019 to use a 3-year average to provide some stability in these projections noting that the individual annual year values do go up and down on a year-to-year basis. However, we have seen this is the second year of decline in 2024. In terms of the directed commercial discard mortality, this is a graphic showing you the time series just of that source of mortality. You'll see three peaks here. The first, back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was largely a function of the derby fishery with different handling practices and lots of lost gear. In the mid-2000s up until 2010, we had seen an increase in this discard mortality, primarily as a function of the large quotas and the minimum size limit. So with a lot of fishing going on in that time period, there were a lot of small fish being handled just due to the sheer volume of the fishery. Then as the quotas came down after 2010, we saw a reduction in commercial discard mortality. However, that's turned around. As of 2020, which was the low point in this time series, we've now seen 4 years of increase to this value of 1.5 million pounds at the end of the time series. If we compare the total mortality accruing to the TCEY, that's all the mortality except U26 non-directed discards, that's what's shown in the gray bars here, to the limits that were set in each year, noting that prior to 2019 or 2018, the Commission was actually setting FCEYs, but we've projected that to make it comparable to the TCEY that would have occurred at that time. You'll note that up to 2019, the various fishery sectors generally captured all the fish that were available to them. We were at or very near the full regulatory limit across the entire coastwide stock in those years. Beginning with 2020 and the challenges that occurred there, we've seen a new period here where the fisheries are capturing fewer fish than are available to them. 2020 was kind of a unique year, but since then, this has been due to various fishery sectors not utilizing their entire limits during the year. You'll note at the very end there that the blue line goes down. The Commission reduced the TCEY in 2024 relative to 2023. However, we do project that the mortality went up slightly. So we saw a slightly better attainment of those quotas in 2024 than we did in 2023. However, I will highlight, as you will see in the fishery statistics paper, that the catch limit attainment in several regulatory areas for the directed fishery in particular, particularly 4B and IPHC regulatory area 4C, D, and E, and to some degree 4A, has been substantially below the limit that's available. And in some cases, in previous years, that was due to a variety of factors. But I think particularly in 4B, we're starting to see a challenge in actually finding and capturing those fish out there in 4B. So that may be something to note. You just saw from Dr. Webster a nice summary of the regional trends in the Coastwide Fishery Independent Setline Survey. Here I'm showing you the coastwide trend from all three of the indices that he showed. From left to right, numbers per skate. In the center, the total pounds per skate. And on the right, the 032 pounds per skate. And the trend here is you see a larger decrease in the 032 pounds per skate than you do in the total pounds. And as Dr. Webster mentioned, we actually saw the numbers went up from 2023 to 2024. So what this is telling us is that we're catching about the same number of fish, but they're turning out to be fewer pounds for that same number of fish, which again indicates this shift from older to younger fish. And we've seen this shift going on now for at least the last 3 seasons, where we've seen greater declines in the 032 pounds than the total, and more stability in the numbers per skate. Now, as Dr. Webster mentioned, we did have a relatively sparse design in 2024. And I want to highlight here our uncertainty in the information that we have. So the percent change from 2023 to 2024 is our point estimate. But if we look at the associated uncertainty with that, we characterize that by the credible interval. In all of these figures, the credible interval is shown as the shaded region. And this is the region over which we have at least a 95% chance that the true value would occur if we were to replay and do that sampling again and again and again. The way to think about this is we would like to think that the true value is somewhere within this range. And you see that those ranges are quite broad. For example, on the left, the credible interval for numbers per skate, even though we think it went up by 3%, it could have been a 7% decline, or it could have been as large as a 14% increase. Now, why is that interval so large? it's due to several different factors. The main factor being the sparse designs that we've seen in the survey, both this year and particularly 2024 and 2023. But as Dr. Webster noted, we're also used a different bait for some of the stations. And as was noted in the questions, the interval associated with the coefficient for that bait is also fairly uncertain. And so that uncertainty also feeds into this coast-wide total. So it's both the change in the design as well as the use of an uncertain calibration coefficient, which also translates into these intervals. You'll note the broad intervals as well on total pounds per skate and O32, noting that at least for O32, we see that the entire range of the credible interval is less than 0. So there, we're fairly confident that we saw a decline from 2023 to 2024 in terms of O32 pounds per skate. Now, if we compare that trend, the O32 pounds per skate, to the directed commercial fishery catch rates, because those are represented from the logbooks, only the landed fish, so those would only be the O32 fish captured by the commercial fishery. You see, in a general sense, across the history of these two time series, that we had high values in the late 1990s through the early 2000s. Both showed a very similar decline through around 2010 or 12. We had some flattening of the trend in both series. And then over the last 4 years, we've seen a decline in both of these series, perhaps somewhat more pronounced in the commercial fishery than in the fishery independent setline survey here shown on the left. Now, I've mentioned in previous stock assessments, presentations, I've highlighted that at the time we do the stock assessment, the commercial fishery is still on the water. And so the information for the most recent year, in this case 2024, remains incomplete. We have fishing still going on. We have some logs that wouldn't have been entered by the time we closed the data sets. Then we had another, I believe, 5.5 weeks of fishing after the deadline for the stock assessment data. Plus, we'll have some vessels that don't encounter one of our port samplers during the season. They may encounter a sampler next year, and those logs will be collected, or they may mail those logs directly to us at some point over the winter, and we will have that data entered for next year. So each year, at the time we do the stock assessment, we have a number of logs outstanding. And what we've learned is that there's a fairly systematic trend in terms of those logs that we don't have at the end of the year. And to show you this, this graphic here shows you for the last 6 years, the coast-wide commercial fishery weight per unit effort, or CPUE, in terms of pounds per skate that was available at the time the assessment was conducted. So those are the incomplete estimates in that year. And then the red line shows you the value that we have now as of 2024. And you can see that in each of those years, subsequent to the assessment, the logs that we got in reduced that index. And that was going on even when the trend was relatively flat, say from 2018 to 2019 and 2019 to 2020. But it was also going on in the last 2 years when we were seeing a steeper downward trend in the commercial fishery CPUE. And you see at the end of this time series, we have the 2024 data point, and we don't yet know how that's going to be updated. Over the course of the entire time series, this adjustment averages only about 2%. But in the last couple of years, it's been 5% in 2022 and 2023. So it seems to be a greater change postseason in the last 2 years than we've seen on average over the previous years, although that value in 2021 was also quite large. So if the same pattern holds up, we might expect that there would be an additional 5% decrease. So we might see a full 7% decrease from 2023 to 2024 if we anticipate the same kind of pattern that we've seen in previous years. Now, I'm spending quite a bit of time on this because this proves to be quite important when we get to the stock assessment results. Now, noting that this information is still incomplete, this then breaks that down into individual fishery sectors within each of the IPHC regulatory areas. Noting that we have a variety of different components here. Starting with 2A, we separate the tribal and non-tribal fisheries. Throughout most of the stock, we can create a separate index for the fixed hook and snap gear. And then in 4C and 4D, we keep those two areas separate for separate evaluation. So looking across the stock, you can see that we do have systematic patterns between these different components. Generally, the snap gear on average is lower than fixed hook, although that's become closer and closer in recent years. And the patterns are mixed. However, there's really no evidence here of a substantially different pattern for one gear type or another, perhaps with the exceptions of 2B and 4B, where particularly for the fixed hook, the sample size is quite small in both of those areas. Now, I want to go into several areas in slightly greater detail. As was noted in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey presentation, we have several areas where we had no direct sampling in 2024. And generally, when we have no sampling from the FIS, we look to the fishery information to help inform us about what the likely trend in that area would be. So on the left here, you see the index for IPHC regulatory area 2A as estimated from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, noting that we had no sampling in 2024 and only a partial survey in 2023. So although our point estimate is a 2% increase from 2023 to 2024, if you look at the credible interval there, or that shaded zone, you can see that spans the range from essentially the lowest value we've ever observed in 2A to nearly the highest value. So in aggregate, we really know very little about where we are in terms of the weight per unit effort in 2A. And as I said, generally we would look to the commercial data to help better understand. However, in 2A, we have a somewhat unique situation, which is that we have two major commercial fisheries, the tribal and the non-tribal fisheries. And these occur not only at different times of the year, but also in different spatial areas. So the tribal fishery generally occurs primarily in the spring and in the northern part of 2A. And the non-tribal fishery occurs in the midsummer, and it's primarily occurs off Oregon and sometimes down into a little bit of Northern California. And so it's very difficult to draw anything conclusive out of this information. Our understanding of the actual trend in 2A is very weak this year. We're anticipating that the greater coverage in 2025 could substantially inform our Fishery Independent Setline Survey as planned. If we move then to going north to IPHC Regulatory Area 4A, this is the second of three areas that we didn't have any direct sampling from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey in 2024. Note here in 4A that we only had a partial survey. The most recent partial survey was in 2022, so we had no sampling in 2023. And so there's a greater amount of uncertainty due to that as well. We do have a small amount of overlap on the Bering Sea edge between the 4A index and the NOAA Fisheries Bering Sea Trawl Survey. So that trawl survey does partially inform this trend information for IPHC Regulatory Area 4A. However, despite that uncertainty, I think the picture here is quite different than in 2A. We see pretty good correspondence between the survey and the commercial fishery trends for both gear types here in 4A. And both of these series are pretty clearly at or very near the lowest value that we've seen in the time series. So although we did not have any direct sampling in 4A, I think it's quite clear that the index both commercial and survey, are low and or as low as we've seen in this area. Now, the last area that we didn't have any direct sampling in 2024 was IPHC Regulatory Area 4B. Our most recent partial survey there was in 2022, and it's actually been several years since we had a more comprehensive survey. I believe 2019 was the last year that we had a fair number of those stations covered. So while our point estimate is that there was a 4% increase in 4B, I would be very skeptical of that level of increase. And in fact, you see that confidence interval there also spans a very wide range. On the commercial side, we saw quite divergent trends between the fixed and the snap gear. However, I would caution your interpretation of that in that the sample sizes are very small for both of those gear types in IPHC Regulatory Area 4B. And so here again, we have a substantial amount of uncertainty, and although there may be some indication of a slight increase at the end of this time series, I would say it's more likely that both of these indices remain at or near the lowest values that we've seen in the time series. Moving now into the biology, this is a recreation of female Pacific halibut weighted age going back into the 1930s. This is based on the information that we have from sampling of the commercial fisheries, and then more recently from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. And here I'm showing you 6 age classes, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 19. And I've selected those ages because as of 2024, that green line at the bottom, the 8-year-olds in 2024, would be the 2016 year class. The third line up, the 12-year-olds in 2024, would be the 2012 year class. And the red line at the top, 19-year-old fish in 2024, would be the 2005 year class. And those are currently the 3 most important year classes in the stock and in the fishery for us. You can see in a general pattern that size at age was quite large in the late 1970s. It declined very steeply through sometime in the early 2000s. Then these trends moderated. We had some flat trends for several years there. And in recent years, we've started to see an improvement in size at age, particularly for the younger age classes, say up to about age 12. Now, that pattern was quite pronounced through last year. When we added this year's information, it seemed to moderate to some degree. We're starting to see a slight decrease in a couple of those younger age categories. And importantly, that red line at the top, that the 19-year-old fish are, not only are they low, but on average, a 19-year-old fish is slightly smaller than the fish that are 16 years old. So we're seeing very little response at the older end of the stock, and some positive trends at the younger ages. We move then from weight at age into what's actually been landed in the commercial fishery. So this is a reconstruction back into the 1990s of just the average size fish landed in each of the IPHC regulatory areas, with the black line down the center representing the coast-wide average. And you can see that tracking the size at age through about 2010, we saw a decline in the average weight of a fish hitting the dock. And since then, it's been relatively stable. IPHC Regulatory Area 2C, the red series with the triangles, has in recent years been, on average, had the largest fish landed at the dock, with IPHC Regulatory Area 2B close behind, both of which above the coast-wide average. Generally, IPHC Regulatory Area 2A is landing the smallest fish on the coast, and these fish are down in the 15-pound range, and that's been consistent for several years now. We move then and look at the age composition information. So this is the recent fishery ages. Across the x-axis is the year, and age is on the y-axis. So the circle represents the proportion of the catch in that year in terms of numbers of fish that were landed that were at that particular age. So a strong diagonal pattern would indicate a strong year class, such as can be seen for the 1987 year class. I will highlight the years 2017 to 23. These are the years for which, through genetic analysis here at IPHC, we can evaluate the fin clips that were collected from each of the fish that we collect an otolith from and determine the sex of that fish. And so for those years, we have resolved the information into males and females, noting that for 2024, the last column of circles on the right, we haven't yet processed those samples. You can see for that time period where we do have the sex-specific information that up until about ages 15 or 16, most of the catch is female Pacific halibut. This is consistent with faster growth from females. Those fish are reaching the 32-inch minimum size limit at a younger age. And then catching up after about age 16 or 17, you start to see that the proportion of males and females begins to balance out. And by the time you get to the oldest fish, we're actually catching more males than females out there in the 24 and 25-year-old range. This is because some of those males are still just reaching the 32-inch minimum size limit, even at 25 years old. I'll bring your attention to the last column, which is the 2024 age composition data, and I'll highlight the 12-year-old fish in 2024. This is the 2012 year class. As we've seen for several years, we've continued to have that switch from the 2005s, which are in a diminishing quantity in the commercial catch now at 19 years old, and a shift to this 2012 year class. In 2024, this was the most numerous component of the commercial halibut fishery catch. You'll also note at age 8 in 2024 is the 2016 year class. This is the next strong year class on the horizon after 2012. And in fact, in 2024, we saw the largest proportion of 8-year-olds that we've seen since the early 1990s. Now that might be good news to see a lot of young fish, except that we also saw the catch rates declining. And so what that suggests is that even though we're getting more of these 8-year-old fish, they're not numerous enough to offset the loss in biomass as we've seen that shift from the older to the younger fish in the last several years. If we look then at a similar graphic for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, now we have sex-specific information over that full time series. We see a similar general pattern with the 1987 year class, then the 2005 year class. And in 2024, in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, which of course includes fish that are both above and below the 32-inch minimum size limit, the 8-year-old fish were the most numerous age class in our survey this year. So this is an explanation for why we could see some consistency in terms of the number of fish caught, but still see a decline in terms of the pounds that we saw in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. So some of these fish were above the minimum size limit, but a large fraction of the 8-year-olds still remain below that 32-inch minimum size limit. And again, here, this is one of the largest fractions of 8-year-olds that we've seen in the time series. So both of these series, we're seeing that continued shift to younger fish. The other information that we get from our Fishery Independent Setline Survey comes in the form of stock distribution. And here, again, I'm going to highlight that due to the reduced fish designs both in 2023 and in 2024, our current information about the stock distribution is fairly uncertain. Starting in the bottom left-hand panel here, this is for all sizes of Pacific halibut. And you see that the credible interval for IPHC regulatory area 4B or biological region 4B ranges between 4 and 12%. So that's a very broad range of potential stock contribution for that biological region. The other thing I want to draw your attention to here is the large shift we've seen over the last 2 decades between Region 3 and Region 2. So where Region 3 used to comprise nearly 2/3 of the coastwide stock, it's declined, and as of 2024, we now see it comprise between 39 and 50% of the coastwide stock. And despite the uncertainty, that trend is pretty clear over the last 2 decades. Conversely, in Region 2, we've seen an increasing trend over that same time period, and where that component of the stock used to comprise approximately 15% of the coastwide stock, it's now approaching twice that, between 24 and 31% of the coastwide stock. So these types of shifts are created not only by direct migration, which does occur to some degree from Region 3 to Region 2, but also shifts in weighted age between the regions and just in terms of general productivity. This is just a representation of where the stock is currently most prominent in terms of the biomass. Now, this is for all sizes of fish. If we then look at a similar pattern just for the legal size of fish, those same trends are there, but they're more pronounced. So the decline is to an even smaller value in Region 3 and a slightly higher value in Region 2. And what this tells us is that this is starting to show us the component of the larger fish for size at age. And it also tells us that a lot of those fish that are still in Region 3 are relatively small fish, small and younger fish. Moving then into the ecosystem conditions for the stock. We have known for several decades that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is correlated to Pacific halibut recruitment. So this figure shows you the Pacific Decadal Oscillation anomalies. Those are the points colored either green or red, depending on whether they're positive or negative. The black line that goes through those points is just a smoother to help you visualize the different phases that we've been through, the different regimes. Similarly, the green and red arrows just show the average magnitude of how positive or how negative each of those regimes was. You can see that we had a positive regime up until sometime in the late 1940s. We then had a long negative regime until the late 1970s, another positive regime until the early 2000s, and then the picture starts to become a little bit more mixed. I will highlight at the end of this time series that we did have a positive PDO from 2014 to 2019. However, so far during that time period, we've yet to see a very strong year class. And I would caution that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation generally does not indicate, is not a good indicator of individual year class strengths. Rather, it correlates to the average over one of these longer, say, 2 to 3 decade long time periods. Also, at the end of that time period, you see that after 2019, the PDO has gone back to relatively strong negative conditions and remained there for the most recent years. I have, I think, just a couple more slides, and then we'll be probably at a good point to take a lunch break. Each year, as I generally do, I went through the various ecosystem reports that are available for the major components of the geographic range of Pacific halibut, from the California Current through the BC coast into the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, and up into the Bering Sea. Those reports are linked at the bottom here. They're extensive reports with a huge amount of detail. And often it's fairly easy to go through those reports and find some factors that may be important, whether they are positive or negative for Pacific halibut. However, to some degree last year and definitely this year, these reports that are highly mixed in terms of the indicators that are coming out of here. It's very unclear whether these ecosystems are favorable or not to Pacific halibut. We see a different response across lots of different species groups, with some things like crab in the Bering Sea doing quite poorly, and other things like salmon off the lower 48 doing much better. So I don't really have any way to characterize this into a simple take-home message here, other than that I think it's difficult to characterize, and that these reports seemingly show new patterns in each of the most recent years, indicating, I think, generally low predictability across these ecosystems. We're starting to see new conditions that we haven't seen in the past. And I guess what this leads us to is the conclusion that it's very hard to necessarily use historical information to say, well, based on what we've seen, this is what we might expect for the next several years. Even with regard to warming patterns, we saw some return toward a near normal or a near average condition in 2024, with still some different patterns. Now, there are a few other data sets we can look at to try and understand whether we might have recruitments coming into the Pacific halibut stock. The first of these is the Eastern Bering Sea Trawl Survey. We know that a lot of the rearing habitat for Pacific halibut, especially from 0 to say 2 to 4 years old, occurs in the Eastern Bering Sea. And this trawl survey captures fish generally from ages 2 to maybe 6 or 8 years old primarily. So it does give us some index of the number of young fish that may be entering the stock, at least in the Bering Sea and perhaps coast-wide. We see 3 peaks here. The first in the early 1990s corresponded to the 1987 year class. And I should have noted that these bars represent the light gray is U26 fish, or the youngest age classes. The darker gray is fish between 26 and 32 inches, so just prior to entering the commercial fishery. And the green component is legal size fish, or O32 fish, that would already be accessible to the commercial fishery. That first peak in the early 1990s corresponded to the 1987 year class. And it doesn't look too spectacular here, but that year class on a coastwide basis was very important for the Pacific halibut stock. The second peak, which is in the late 2000s, corresponds to the 2005 year class. Now, that peak looks much better in the Bering Sea than the earlier one, but in fact, the 2000 year class was much smaller on a coastwide basis, suggesting perhaps that more of that particular year class recruitment occurred in the Bering Sea, but not so much in other areas. And so coastwide, it turned into more or less an average recruitment, where it looked pretty good in the Bering Sea. Now, there is an indication at the end of this time series in the early 2020s of another year class coming, perhaps in the 2016 to 2018 range. We have yet to complete the aging of the samples collected in 2023 and 2024, so it's difficult to resolve exactly which year class this was. However, I will note at the end of this time series, there was a fairly sharp drop in the 2024 index, primarily driven by those U26 fish, which would indicate that whichever year class or year classes this turns out to be is already on its way moving through the system, perhaps already exiting the Bering Sea and filling in the rest of the stock. The age composition information from this survey, as I mentioned, is primarily comprised of 2 to say 8-year-old fish. You see those strong year classes associated with 1987 and 2005. And then at the end of this time series, some evidence of these younger fish that we're seeing in the third peak. However, again, this is created from an age length key, and we don't yet have specific ages for 2023 and 2024, which creates some smearing of these age classes. We will likely be able to better resolve these individual age classes when we are able to age those samples, which I believe is ongoing here at the Commission. Finally, the last source of potential information on incoming recruitment comes from Alaska Department of Fish and Game recreational sampling, which occurs in the charter fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 3A. While this is not very geographically comprehensive, the recreational fishery in 3A does encounter a fairly large number of young fish, and that we do have sex-specific information through 2022. Again, here we've not yet aged the 2023 and 2024 samples. So if we look particularly at the 2022 information, I highlight that in 2022, the greatest proportion of fish were 6 years old, which would correspond again to that 2016 year class. So we're seeing this corroboration across a wide range of data sets that we've had this multi-year shift from 2005 year class to the 2012s, and now we're starting to see that 2016 is likely the next important year class coming along behind 2012. And so with that summary, perhaps I'll pause there and see if this is a good time to take our lunch break.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it would be a good time to take a lunch break. And we get back, I would say, at 1:10.
Thanks very much.